You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Welcome to True Spies, the podcast that takes you deep inside the greatest secret missions of all time.
Suddenly, out of the darkness appeared Bin Laden.
You'll meet the people who live life undercover. What do they know? What are their skills? And what would you do in their position?
Vengeance felt good. Seeing these people pay for what they'd done felt righteous.
True Spies from Spyscape Studios, wherever you get your podcasts.
There's no question that Trump shows little respect for women, despite his claims to the contrary.
Nobody has more respect for women than I do. Nobody. Nobody has more respect.
Please, everybody.
To prove it, I could point to the recently released Epstein files and suggest that, at the very least, he is as guilty as the recently arrested Prince Andrew, a creep who objectified and abused, trafficked women and girls, or at worst, a sex criminal, a rapist and a pedophile, if allegations in the files can be proven and therefore believed. Otherwise, I could assemble a supercut of his gross statements, his comments about women's bodies, his bragging about groping, his self-defense against assault allegations resting on his lack of attraction to his accusers. But it's enough to hear him talking years before his presidency about his own marriage and his view of a woman's place.
You know, I don't want to sound too much like a chauvinist, but when I come home and dinner's not ready, I go through the roof.
We get along very well, and there's not a lot of disagreement because ultimately Ivana does exactly as I tell her to do.
See, wait a minute.
Made a chauvinist.
Right, men? Is that right? Huh?
He's not a chauvinist, is he?
Oh, he's the worst.
And yet he is praised by his supporters for elevating women to high office. It's true that he has appointed a relatively high number of women to his cabinet, but this is relative to other Republicans. If we're simply counting the share of women appointments, Biden appointed the highest share of women at 48%, and Bill Clinton the second highest. The reality is that Trump's number of female appointees is only high on the right and was far lower during his first term of office. Then there are the highest-ranking female appointments in his administration. Trump appointed a woman, Susie Wiles, to be his chief of staff. She is the first woman to hold that role. He also appointed Pam Bondi, his attorney general, and Kristi Noem, the Secretary of Homeland Security. These are prominent positions, but all other recent administrations have appointed women to much higher positions. Clinton, Bush, and Obama all chose women as Secretary of State. Madeleine Albright, Condoleezza Rice, and Hillary Clinton. Biden chose a woman as his running mate, giving us the first female vice president. In this context, Trump's record on elevating women is decidedly lackluster. Then there's the fact that he specifically appoints yes women, in keeping with his chauvinist views that a man should tell women what to do. Historically, the role of White House Chief of Staff has been one of gatekeeper, a check on the potential harms any president might inflict. But Wiles has differentiated herself in the role as a bag woman. She has proven unwilling to do anything to restrain Trump's whims and his agenda, choosing instead to act as a facilitator of all his plans, no matter how unconstitutional. And the same can be said of his other prominent appointees, Pam Bondi, former Attorney General of Florida, who made a name for herself as an enemy of human traffickers and is now cheerfully running interference to prevent any participators in Jeffrey Epstein's human trafficking ring from being held responsible for their actions. And Kristi Noem, a former governor who made a name for herself as an ally of farmers and an opponent of masking, now deploying a masked secret police force to abduct immigrants and thereby decimate the agricultural workforce nationwide. As he told us himself, Trump likes women when they do what he says. Most women, though, see him for what he is, as the gender gap in his support makes clear. Last year, during his State of the Union, Democratic congresswomen wore pink to signify their opposition to his policies, and this year they wore white, citing specifically Trump's attacks on their right to vote as a five-alarm crisis for gender equality. Trump's Save America Act, a voter suppression gambit that aims to require photo IDs for voting, is expected to disenfranchise millions of women who changed their name after marrying. Trump and his administration, it seems, would like to return to the bad old ways of femme covert or coverture, when women moved from being the legal property of their fathers to becoming the legal property of their husbands and having no legal standing or rights of themselves. This arrangement was framed as being natural, a part of the male-female relationship dynamic, women being placed, quote, under the protection and cover, end quote, of her man. We can hear Trump expressing this very idea when he told women voters on the campaign trail that he was their protector.
You will be protected, and I will be your protector. Women. And my people told me about 4 weeks ago, I was saying, no, I want to protect the people. I want to protect the women of our country. I want to protect the women. Sir, please don't say that. Why? They said, we think it's very inappropriate for you to say. I said, why? I'm president. I want to protect the women of our country. They said, sir, I just think it's inappropriate for you to say. I pay these guys a lot of money. Can you believe it? I said, well, I'm going to do it whether the women like it or not. I'm going to protect them.
To show how devoted Trump really is to protecting women, take a look at his actions. Working to remove sexual health care and deny reproductive rights, removing anti-sex discrimination protections and cutting off access to family planning services, even choking off access to food stamp benefits, which disproportionately leads to hunger among women and children. Working to ban sexual health care and deny reproductive rights. And the threat he poses to women doesn't end at our borders. When the Republican congressional leadership just sat back and let Trump and Elon Musk's Doge dismantle U.S. aid, it led to a loss of economic opportunities for women generally, as well as the destruction of millions of dollars in contraceptives, the shuttering of clinics in numerous countries, and an increase in maternal mortality rates globally. Women, as we always see, are among the first victims of authoritarianism, and it's often worst under religious extremism. What we are seeing is the fate of women under Christian nationalism. So now, as Trump once again, without irony, proclaims Women's History Month, I think it's important to remember a brilliant and influential woman whose memory must be reclaimed from the myths men made of her. This is Historical Blindness. I'm Nathaniel Lloyd, and I ask you to consider with me the life of a woman who was a martyr, killed by the forces of religious extremism, anti-intellectualism, religious intolerance, and misogyny, whose memory was afterward co-opted by them. Thank you for listening to the Martyrdom of Hypatia of Alexandria. Before we begin, it's time to thank the newest patrons of the podcast. Before we continue, I want to thank my newest patrons. Thanks, Tell and Irma Ash. And thank you to all my patrons. Patrons of the show get access to an exclusive RSS feed with ad-free versions of the show, early release of episodes, teasers, and exclusive minisodes between every main release, making this a weekly podcast for patrons on Patreon. If you hear minisodes and think they're little blurbs or insubstantial sound bites, think again. They're fully researched and produced episodes, anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes long, and they tie in with the main episode topics. And they even sometimes fill in the gaps and tell the rest of the story that my main episode didn't have time to tell. For example, after my episode on Crispus Attucks, I explored the parallels between ICE today and the slave catchers of the 19th century. and after my episode on the systemic racism of both gun rights and gun control laws historically, I explored the history of the Black Panthers further, with a focus on the FBI's campaign to destroy them and the murder of Fred Hampton. For listeners who are interested, I also sell these exclusive minisodes for just $3 a pop. So head over to patreon.com/historicalblindness and consider purchasing the occasional blind spot minisode that interests you, or supporting the podcast for as little as $1 a month. Now, let's continue the episode. Welcome to Historical Blindness. There is no question of Hypatia's historicity. She was a real person. She lived from the middle of the 4th century CE to the year 415, and her life was attested in an ecclesiastical history published within 25 years of her death. There even exist contemporaneous sources attesting to the reality of her existence, such as letters written to her by one of her students, Synesius of Cyrene, later the bishop of the ancient Libyan city Ptolemais, along with letters he wrote to others that make mention of her. It is important to address her historicity early because she has become very much mythologized. And before we pull apart the tangled knot of legends surrounding her, we must at least establish that she was a real person. Like so many other women in history, nothing at all is known of Hypatia's mother. She has been lost to time, but we do know about her father. She grew up in the center of ancient learning, Alexandria, daughter of the mathematician and scholar Theon of Alexandria. Little is known of Theon as well, but it is clear that he was active in making astronomical calculations, predicting eclipses as early as 364 CE. He is known to have edited, commented on, and otherwise written about, and therefore preserved, a variety of important ancient works, like Euclid's Elements and Ptolemy's Almagest. An inscription on the latter of these works further attests to the historicity of Hypatia, as it indicates it was, quote, prepared by my daughter Hypatia. And there are further indications that she even contributed to some of his work. Her father, who was identified in a 10th century encyclopedia as a man of the Moseon, was apparently the head of a school in Alexandria. This school is sometimes confused with the Moseon of Alexandria, which some believe was associated with or housed the famous Library of Alexandria. But that Hellenistic institution had declined and been shuttered following the destruction of the library. Theon's Moseon appears to have been a different school in Alexandria, perhaps founded in imitation of that former institution. I'll say more about their supposed connection to the Library of Alexandria later. Theon and his daughter Hypatia after him were Neoplatonists. They favored the more traditional teachings of Plotinus over the teachings of Iamblichus, who had embraced theurgy, or ritual magic, and taken the philosophy in a different, more overtly religious direction. Iamblichian Neoplatonism was taught in the more commonly known Alexandrian school of the time, the Serapeum. So it stands to reason that Theon and Hypatia ran their Moseon as an alternative school, teaching Platinian Neoplatonism. There's some indication, based on other inscriptions of his work, that Theon also had a son, but it was Hypatia who succeeded him. In her school, she was known to teach not only mathematics, but also the philosophies of Aristotle and Plato. She was known to hold forth in public lectures on philosophy, and it was said that students traveled great distances to enter her tutelage. While the contributions of her father have been described as minor, Hypatia was renowned far and wide. Alexandria was considered a central hub of philosophy, second only to Athens, and Hypatia was a fixture appearing in the streets wearing the traditional tree-bone cloak of the philosopher. One contemporary, Socrates Scholasticus of Constantinople, described her accomplishments with the highest praises, saying she, quote, made such attainments in literature and science as to far surpass all the philosophers of her own time, end quote. Like her father before her, she edited and wrote commentaries on a number of important works, including Apollonius of Perga's Conics, Diophantus's Arithmetica, and possibly also Archimedes' Measurement of a Circle. On the understanding that she must have been a leading mathematician in her day to comment on such texts, it's generally considered that she excelled her father in mathematics. There is evidence of her advanced skill in astronomy, and the letters of her pupil, Synesius, indicate she was an engineer as well, in that she had knowledge of the construction of such devices as the astrolabe and the hydrometer. Mention of her construction of these devices has led to false claims that she invented them, thus adding inventor to her long list of accomplishments. But the devices Synesius mentioned had been in use before her time. There's no need to embellish her story in this way to make her more impressive, as she was, in truth, extremely impressive. A woman holding a place of honor and respect among men who, according again to Socrates Scholasticus, quote, on account of the self-possession and ease of manner which she had acquired in the consequence of the cultivation of her mind, and on account of her extraordinary dignity and virtue, admired her the more, end quote. Nevertheless, she has been consistently mythologized in this way. In later years after her death, when Neoplatonist historians wrote about her as a martyr, elements were introduced to her story that cannot be confirmed, such as how exceedingly beautiful she was, and that she never married and remained a virgin her whole life. One such later author, Damascus, told apocryphal stories about how she had fended off the advances of amorous male suitors. He related one dubious story about Hypatia driving away one lustful young man by showing him her used minstrel rags and saying, quote, "This is what you really love, my young man, but you do not love beauty for its sake," end quote. On account of stories like this, Hypatia now has a reputation as a proto-feminist, and it was in this direction that her legend developed through the centuries. Considering the fact that she was a pagan scholar who died at the hands of a Christian mob, modern retellings of her story frequently make of her an enlightened free thinker, struggling against the backward ignorance of her day. What we must ascertain is how accurate such depictions of Hypatia might really be. To get a clear sense of the circumstances surrounding Hypatia's death, we must understand the political situation in Alexandria. It was the capital of Egypt, not only a center of learning, of science and philosophy, but also of religion, and especially of early Christianity. In these years, after Roman Emperor Theodosius I had divided the empire into prefectures and organized the church into dioceses, the Alexandrian church was very powerful. In ecclesiastical structure, the Church of Constantinople was next in authority under Rome, but in practice, Alexandria had far greater influence and was more in conflict with Rome over many issues, which would eventually lead to a schism between them years after Hypatia's death. But Alexandria was not totally dominated by the Christian church. The city was a tinderbox of religious factionalism. There were the pagans and the followers of Greek philosophical traditions, like the Neoplatonism that Hypatia continued to teach. There was a community of Jews, and there were many Christians, but also among the Christians themselves there were many different factions. There may have still persisted in some corners of Alexandria certain Christian heresies like Gnosticism and Arianism, but mostly the conflict was between the dominant Nicene Christian church and the Novatians. More than 100 years earlier, following Roman Emperor Decius's persecution of Christians, one newly elected pope, Cornelius, was accused of being too lenient with Christians who had denied their faith during the persecutions. This backlash was led by a priest named Novatian, who became an anti-pope of sorts. During Hypatia's time in Alexandria, this schism remained a major dividing issue among the Christians, and the complex interplay of all this religious factionalism contributed to a conflict between Orestes, the imperial prefect and therefore the highest-ranking Roman official of the city, and Cyril, the new archbishop of Alexandria. The prefect Orestes was himself a Christian, but he had cultivated working relationships with many of the religious communities that Cyril considered idolaters and heretics, the pagans, the Jews, and the Novatian Christians. Orestes appears to have worked closely with Hypatia, whose counsel may have provided him some moral authority and credibility among all the communities in the city, as many had come to respect her as a thinker. Indeed, Hypatia even had a good reputation among Christians, despite being a pagan, because many of her students were Christian, including perhaps her most prominent student, Synesius, who had been close with the previous archbishop. But around the year 415 CE, the feud between Orestes and the new archbishop Cyril became out of control, drawing her in and leading directly to her death. Now for a brief intermission.
Blizzard Entertainment presents Midnight, the newest expansion for World of Warcraft. Midnight calls every hero home to Azeroth. All paths lead to this moment. Xalatath rises, the Void follows, and the Sunwell stands in peril. Raiders, explorers, storytellers, newcomers, and legends alike. This is your world, your story, your moment. Because Azeroth is home, and home is always worth fighting for. Available now at worldofwarcraft.com.
It's tax season, and at LifeLock, we know you're tired of numbers. But here's a big one you need to hear. Billions. That's the amount of money in refunds the IRS has flagged for possible identity fraud. Now here's another big number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, we'll fix it guaranteed. One last big number. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit lifelock.com/podcast for the threats you can't control. Terms apply.
No one hates history, they just haven't found the right teacher yet. Or in this case, a nerdy best friend who loves to tell you all about world history, women's history, and weird history. Hi, I'm TK, the creator of For the Love of History podcast, a place for people who want to learn more but don't know where to start, and history lovers who want to break from the mainstream. From rat trials to warrior women, we cover topics from every country and era. Whether you're a history expert or just starting out, there's a place for you here in the Time Machine. So join me every Friday on your favorite podcast platform and YouTube for a brand new topic. See you there. Bye.
Now, back to the show. The Nicene Christians of Alexandria waged a war on those who thought and worshipped differently than them, and this war had been ongoing for decades. In 391, the previous archbishop, Theophilus, had closed the Serapeum and put an end to the Iamblichian Neoplatonist cult of the city. Hypatia and her school may have survived this because she taught a different kind of Neoplatonism, as well as other philosophy and mathematics and astronomy, and because she had shown herself friendly to Christians, taking on Christian students and earning the respect of the archbishop. Theophilus's successor to the bishopric, Cyril, continued this war against quote-unquote idolaters, driving the Novatian heretics out of the city next. Finally, he turned his attention to persecuting the Jews, and there was suspicion that Orestes would try to oppose this, as it further weakened the coalition he had built in ruling the city. One day, Orestes had an edict posted during a dance performance that was largely attended by the city's Jewish population. It was just a declaration that such performances would be limited, but apparently Cyril had sent a spy among the Jews to read the edict, suspicious about what communiques Orestes might be having with their community. The Jews in the crowd recognized this spy as Hierax, one of Archbishop Cyril's men, and there was unrest in the streets over his presence among them, such that Orestes had Hyrax arrested and tortured to find out what Cyril had sent him there to do. Cyril blamed the Jews for this affair rather than Orestes, and further threatened their community. Then one night, all hell broke loose. In the middle of the night, according to perhaps untrustworthy Christian versions of the event, shouts rang out declaring that the Christian church was on fire, and when Christians exited their homes, many were attacked and killed. Cyril asserted that it had been an evil plot by the city's Jews to murder Christians. With only the church's version of events preserved, we may never know the truth of what happened, but knowing the history of the world and the long tradition of falsely accusing Jews of conspiracy to murder Christians, I read this story skeptically. Cyril responded by driving the Jews from the city and looting their belongings. This infringement on Orestes' civil authority further deepened their rift, and afterward, when Cyril offered him a Bible, either as a gesture of reconciliation or a symbol that Orestes should bend to the authority of the church, Orestes refused the gift. Suddenly, groups of Cyril's supporters gathered in the city streets, accusing Orestes of being a pagan. This doesn't appear to have been a grassroots uprising, as the unrest was among Cyril's own Parabolani bodyguards and hermit monks from the desert who may have had some connection to Cyril and traveled into Alexandria simply to act as his thugs and raise hell in the streets. At one point, they attacked Orestes himself in his carriage, throwing stones at him and nearly killing him. Orestes arrested one monk who had attacked him and had him tortured and executed. Cyril declared the monk a martyr, even though he had not been killed for his faith, but rather for inciting a riot and attempting to assassinate the prefect. Around this point, Cyril and his followers turned their violence against Hypatia. They waylaid her carriage, dragged her to an old pagan temple, stripped her nude, and flayed her alive, using discarded shards of pottery and roof tiles. The violence of her murder was horrific. They cut out her eyes, dismembered her, and burned the remains. The enduring question is why? Why did these Christians attack her? One long-lived characterization of the murder was that Christians hated her for her brilliance and for being a woman, a theory that depicts early Christians as ignorant and prejudiced fools and is often used to criticize evangelical Christian anti-intellectualism and bigotry today. First, it should be noted that this story is often paired with a false claim that it was these selfsame Christians who had destroyed the great library of Alexandria. This certainly would be a powerful historical analogy for evangelicals who want to ban books today, but it's a complete myth. In fact, the Great Library at Alexandria enters recorded history already as legendary, and no archaeological site has ever been located that confirms its existence. What we know from records is that it was destroyed around 48 or 47 BCE during Julius Caesar's campaign against Pompey. Even the museum of which it had been a part was destroyed during Aurelian's campaign to reunite the Roman Empire in the 3rd century. So it was not around in Hypatia's time. It is, however, true that the Alexandrian church had destroyed the Serapeum in their conflict with the city's pagans, and there may have been a collection of scrolls there, sometimes called a quote-unquote daughter library to the Great Library of Alexandria. However, no records survive that indicate the Christians who dismantled that temple destroyed any such collection. So there's no sound basis at all for a claim of the Alexandrian church actually burning books in that way. Nevertheless, some may argue that even if there is no evidence of actual book burning, this is all evidence of the persecution of pagans and their systematic erasure at the hands of early Christians. Some Christian apologists today will excuse the actions of the Alexandrian church, suggesting the pagans had it coming because of some preceding riots or killings of Christians, And these are also the same who will say the Jews of the city had it coming because of their plot to kill the Christians. I suppose they must also defend the church's expulsion of heretics and schismatics from the city, and the seizing of their property, though I haven't seen this. Essentially, those who seek to defend the church's actions back then suggest that even though Cyril's church was the most powerful religious group in the city, supposedly they were the victims of persecution, and everyone else that they in turn persecuted had it coming. Excuse me while I scoff. As for Hypatia herself, many who defend the early church will insist that it was a purely political matter. Unfortunate, certainly, but nothing to do with her being a woman or an intellectual or a pagan. They will characterize her attackers as an angry mob with no real association with the church, even though chroniclers explicitly state that the attack was led by an educated church lector named Peter. There have been a few different theories as to why the church might turn on her, even though she was respected by her Christian students and had previously been in good graces with the archbishop. One looks at a certain chronicler's assertion that, quote, she suffered for her exceptional skills, especially in astronomy, end quote, to suggest that she had been involved in a doctrinal dispute about calculations of the vernal equinox and the true date of Easter, an issue that was then driving a wedge between the Alexandrian and Roman churches. However, there's really no strong evidence for this speculation. The clearest explanation is just that her association with Orestes led to her murder. To return to our contemporaneous source, Socrates Scholasticus states that it was believed Hypatia's counsel was preventing any reconciliation between Orestes and Cyril. A simple and tidy explanation. No hatred of women, no anti-intellectualism, no religious intolerance of paganism. But let's think about that. Orestes was accused of being a pagan, which would seem to indicate that the Alexandrian church viewed her influence over him as drawing him away from Christianity, as inherently corruptive. It's often argued that the early church wasn't intolerant of the Greek philosophy that Hypatia taught because Christians were among her students, and there was significant embrace and syncretism of Greek philosophy within the early Christian church. While the influence of Greek philosophy is certainly present in the New Testament, as I argued in my recent holiday special, the fact is that Tertullian, considered the founder of Western Christianity, who had been writing in Roman Africa just a couple centuries earlier, and whose work was therefore very influential in the Alexandrian church, had argued that Greek philosophy was the root of all heresies. And a few centuries later, the way Egyptian Bishop John of Nikiu demonized her gives a clear sense of the church's actual views on Hypatia. He writes that she, quote, was devoted at all times to magic, and she beguiled many people through her satanic wiles, end quote. Of her relationship with Orestes, he claims, quote, she had beguiled him through her magic. He ceased attending church as had been his custom, and he not only did this, but he drew many believers to her, and he himself received the unbelievers at his house, end quote. In this enduring characterization of Hypatia as a corruptive influence, we see all the elements that church apologists claim are a myth. Paganism is demonized as Satanism. Taking scientific and intellectual counsel is depicted as necessarily anti-Christian, and behind it all lurks misogyny. She is said to, quote-unquote, beguile with her, quote-unquote, wiles. It harkens back to the stereotype of the temptress, like Eve in the Garden of Eden. And when we consider the manner of her murder, how she was stripped naked before being brutally cut apart, and compare this to the attack on Orestes, who had been struck in the head with a rock and survived, I think the vicious misogyny of her death is apparent. So while some might caution against attributing her murder to the church and its intolerance, its anti-intellectualism, its bigotry and misogyny, it seems absurd to claim that none of these were factors. And to put a final point on the matter, after her murder, her school collapsed, and according to Stephen Greenblatt, this, quote, effectively marked the downfall of Alexandrian intellectual life, end quote. Many scholars view her as the, quote, last of the Hellenes, end quote, and her death as the end of the classical era. So in the end, I can't see it as anything but a vile stain on the Christian church, one among many. Ironically, the murder of Hypatia was reminiscent of the martyring of Christians during the persecutions under Roman Emperor Decius, and the later accounts of her life, which claimed she had remained a virgin, also tended toward the hagiographic, making of her a sort of saint. Perhaps because of this, within a few hundred years, Christians had co-opted her story and folded it into a tale of one of their own saints. Starting in the 8th century, we find the first evidence of a cult to a woman called Catherine, also of Alexandria. According to the legend that grew about her, she had been a beautiful woman who was exceedingly well educated and wise, and had remained a virgin all her days. However, this Catherine was said to have been a Christian. Part of her legend has it that the Roman emperor summoned 50 pagan philosophers to engage her in public debate, trying to undermine her faith. But she brilliantly held forth and won the debate, holding firm to her Christian beliefs. In fact, so convincing was her oratory that many of these pagan philosophers were converted. Afterward, as the story goes, the emperor subjected her to torture, but with the help of God and his angels she endured, and her suffering further converted many, until the emperor, in a last-ditch effort to convert her, offered to make her his empress. She refused, for Jesus Christ was her husband, she said. The emperor condemned her to be broken on the wheel, but the breaking wheel itself broke into pieces when she was put upon it, and she remained unbroken. Finally, she was beheaded, and the tale claims that milk flowed from her in place of blood. It is quite a tale, but unsurprisingly, there is no evidence that Catherine of Alexandria actually existed. And once scholars came to recognize that her legend was a propagandistic retelling of the story of Hypatia, the cynical co-option of her story by Christians becomes clear. After Hypatia died, she became a martyr to paganism and philosophy. An anti-Christian polemic appeared in the form of a letter said to have been written by Hypatia. It was a forgery, but this makes abundantly clear that she was already being used as a symbol by critics of the church. Yet we find that within a few hundred years, Christians had turned around her story to claim Christian wisdom had triumphed over pagan foolishness, and to emphasize Christian persecution and murder at the hands of pagans. It's a masterclass in cynically stealing and reinventing a narrative to suit one's own agenda. Throughout history since that time, Hypatia's story has been used in many ways. She was used in anti-Catholic tracts, again, in the early modern period, and she was depicted as a rationalist by Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire. She became the tragic heroine of much romantic literature in the 19th century, and was portrayed by others as the last champion of science before the Dark Ages. To some, she is the first victim of a witch hunt. To others, a symbol of early feminism. The story of Hypatia is one of a symbol of a woman whose memory has been held up by many as an example for different lessons. And certainly that is what I am doing here as well. I concede that. Yet when I see notorious abuser of women, Donald Trump, whose policies have done material harm to women, stand before the press claiming to celebrate women's history, portraying himself as a champion and protector of women, I can't help but think of Hypatia, murdered in the street by religious zealots. Hypatia, whose memory would afterwards be used to empower and grow the very church that killed her. Thanks for listening to Historical Blindness. As always, special thanks go out to my partner patrons, Diane Lane, Joe Escott, Devlin Hoff, Lisa, Prickly Pear, Fred R. Grotice, Robin Naggett, Don Mundus, Eunice Allen Bradley, Juliet O'Connor, Jonathan Williams, Joshua Luddington, Christine LeBlanc, Lonnie C., Kaylee, Ama, Christopher L. Burton, Benny Slater, Chris BDG, Jocelyn Clausen, Lindsay McAllister, Brian, Jamie Nielsen, Martin Robistow, Josh Haberman, and AJ. I want to wish all you patrons an informative Women's History Month. Here's a recommendation for a podcast I think you'll love. Check out Dig, a history podcast, researched, written, and hosted by 4 brilliant women historians, covering tons of fascinating topics, many of them focused on women in history. Enjoy. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows, like The Constant and Who Did What Now. Some music on this episode was licensed through a Blue Dot Sessions blanket license at the time of the episode's publication. Additional music is by Kai Engel, licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Check out the show notes for a list of the tracks used. You can support the show by pledging on Patreon or by making a one-time donation on PayPal. Find those links in the show notes or find me on Venmo at Historical Blindness. Until next time, let's think on the words of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who, in arguing against the notion that a woman's only sphere of influence is domestic and her only proper place, the home, raised, quote, the fair Hypatia in Alexandria, end quote, as an example, pointing out that there have always been such women of genius and that, quote, there has never seemed to be any doubt in the verdict of mankind that they ought to follow their nature and that their particular sphere was the one to which they are called, end quote.
Hi, I'm Jane Wakefield, and I host The Human in the Loop in partnership with Gravity. That's Gravity with 2 E's, helping organisations innovate with AI securely. We explore the rise of AI agents, their history, their potential, and the risks organisations must navigate as they scale. Search for Human in the Loop wherever you get your podcasts.
Are you earning and investing in the stock market, in real estate? How about in relationships? Are you earning and investing in your life? I'm Doc G, semi-retired hospice physician and host of the Earn and Invest podcast, where we have the 201 or next level conversations about money and life. Not only how you make money and grow it, but also how you use your wealth to create a better and more fulfilling existence. Join us every Monday and Thursday wherever you listen to fine podcasts.